What is up, guys? We are back on the Crew 2 today to get some insight on the Nissan 300ZX Z32 Malu Edition. This car is of course going to be available after you guys get the Malu's memoirs completed. I will get into that more here in a second, but first impressions of this car though and driving this thing down the road, I have to admit one thing. I really don't think the Z32 is going to be a terrible car, and which I do think having new cars like the Malu Edition will actually mix up some of the variety of this game a bit, especially in summits, even though some of these vehicles in this game are definitely not going to be that great overall. But as I did mention before, guys, you will have to complete the Malu's Memoir story to actually get this Z unlocked, and luckily this one's not going to be as long as some of the other ones we did see in Season 5. For this, you will have to go through 12 steps to actually get this one done. Normally, I did notice a lot of these stories tend to take around, like, let's say an hour or maybe 2.5 or so, at least depending on the vehicle class you do actually want to use. So, if you use something like a street and or like a rallycross vehicle, it's probably going to take a tad longer. I did notice many of the players I was seeing when doing this story, though, most of them were using like a hypercar and or like an Alpha GP car, that way they can be faster. So, I guess it is going to come down to the vehicle you guys do want to use, but to be honest, I would say going after and getting these stories done really is going to be worth it. For one, you actually get to move the Malu Edition over to Motorfest in December, which is going to be Season 2 of that game, so at least you can move these cars over, and that way you actually have new vehicles you can mess around with. And the main reason why I say that about this Nissan though is I do feel like a lot of people are probably not the biggest fan of this car, and they're most likely kind of upset that we actually got like a 300ZX as like a reward, which I would say I can't really judge you though because we obviously had a Nissan 300ZX in an American Legends update, so that doesn't necessarily add up. But overall though, guys, the Malu Edition is a pretty cool car though. For one, it's going to have a very unique body kit on this car, plus it has two different colored rims, which if you actually were trying to do that to like the regular 300, it's not even going to be an option on this car. And driving this thing for a bit now, I would have to actually say it's not going to be a bad car either. And do keep in mind, by the way, guys, you can also move cars over afterwards as well, so you can actually jump back onto the Crew 2 and actually do some of the stories if you guys actually wanted to get some of these cars. I would probably say a lot of players most likely might end up coming back onto this game just to go after some of these older vehicles that you might not actually be able to unlock unless you actually jump back onto the Crew 2, so at least you can transfer them over later. I really love the fact that they're actually doing that, but nonetheless, though, looking at this Malu's edition right now, so here's the customization, which obviously for this car is not going to be that much, and all you can actually do is basically going to be the livery, which if you guys did remove this, all it's going to do is take off that back flower piece, and of course you can add this back for like $6,000 or something like that, so it luckily isn't going to be a big deal if you actually did remove it. But so far though, I really do like the fact that some of these cars do have special customization to them. For example, guys, having two different colored rims I think would be an awesome thing for the Crew 2, and I really do think a lot of drift cars actually have stuff like that on them. And of course there is going to be street builds with the exact same thing, so I really do hope Motorfest actually has these special kinds of things you can do to really make a lot of the cars insanely unique even more than before. Now the body kit on this car is also going to look insanely nice. It does fit perfectly. One thing I did notice though is for some odd reason the front of this car looks insanely sad though. Um, I really don't know why it looks like that because you do see the intercooler. It really does look like this car is actually insanely depressed, which I really don't know why the front of it does look like this, but that's most likely going to come down to the headlights popping up on the front, which makes it look kind of sad. But besides that though, guys, the overall design of the Malu's edition is actually pretty sweet. And I do feel like a lot more people are actually going to like this car, especially the more that they actually do use it. I was also one of those people as well. Like, for example, guys, when I first got this car, I was like, you know what, maybe it's kind of cool, but I'm not like the biggest fan of it. And funnily enough, the more I actually drive this car, the more that I do use it. And I really do appreciate the attention to detail with these special vehicles. And I really do feel like Motorfest is most likely going to have a lot more of these special cars. I really cannot wait to see what they do with the cars on that game. But besides all that, though, guys, let's go do an outside look of this Malu's edition right now. And of course, take a closer look at this interior and do a top speed test. So moving over to the outside look of the Nissan ZX here, you guys will also notice the front of this car is actually still very sad. I actually noticed you cannot move down the actual headlight pieces, which is kind of odd. I did actually think you could move them down and or up, but apparently not. But the rest of the car really does look pretty dang nice, even with the sun going down in game at the moment. I really do love the way the blue looks, plus it really does give you like a Hawaii feel, and of course it is going to be a ZX with that signature engine sound. And then moving over to the interior view of the ZX, I would say a lot of players most likely notice that nice full tank of fuel, but I do think a lot of people most likely notice the shifter and or like the piece on top of the mirror. I really do like the little pieces of detail that they throw into these cars, and it's probably not going to be a thing like a lot of people most likely notice right off the bat though, and or really pay lots of attention to, because if you are racing, you're most likely not going to be going, oh man, look at the shifter in my car, that's sweet. No, you really do have to look at the road and actually race, so I do feel like a lot of people most likely aren't looking for that, but even with those tiny pieces changed in the ZX, you really can't tell it's special. But besides all that though guys, let's see what the top speed of this 300ZX actually is. So I would say this car probably isn't going to be the fastest thing. And the main reason why I say that is some of the 5 speeds tend to be a tad slower. Of course, if we actually look at like the Lime Edition and or like the Camaro RS and the Motor Pass, both of those cars actually do over 250, so I guess in some ways that's not going to be completely true, but the 300ZX is going to do around, so it looks like 241 miles an hour is going to be the top speed of this car, so it's by far not going to be like the fastest street car in the game. I really do feel like it's not going to completely matter though, because I did notice even with a car having a slower top speed, I do find some of these cars to still be insanely comparable to some of the better street cars. Even on some of the longer events, which I would say a bigger top speed, like something like the new Nissan GTR, I believe it's like the Haru's edition. That car does like 275. So I would say something like that is going to be insanely useful in like a bigger event. But if you guys are using a car with like a slower top speed like the ZX, I would still say this car is good enough to compete in those events. Looking at this on another aspect though guys, if we look at like the 429 Lime Edition, that car does like around 258 miles per hour, and I really do feel like a lot of people are most likely not going to be buying the Motor Pass for that car. We also have the Camaro RS Ghost Edition, which does like 254, so the Malu Edition here is indeed going to be slower than both of those cars, doing around 241. I would actually say it's going to be pretty average though, because a lot of the other street cars do have a very similar top speed to this one, like the Q60 doing like 240. We also have like the Porsche GT4 Cayman also doing around 243, so I wouldn't necessarily say the Malu Edition's actually going to be insanely slow. In fact, I would almost say it's going to be slightly average and or very comparable to those cars. And of course, even with something like the Malu Edition, it's probably not going to be breaking any records, but I really don't think that's going to matter in a summit. For one, guys, you can actually get a pretty decent score and at least be in platinum, which I would say is going to be most of many players' actual goal, is to actually be in platinum. I'm also not going to break records in the summits, and I'm actually not really doing my best in them. And the main reason for that though is I do like messing around with odd cars like the Malu Edition to really see how some of these cars actually do compete in some of these summits, because let's be honest, a lot of the best vehicles in the game are most likely going to continue to dominate, and I would say a lot of players are most likely going to use those, but I really do feel like if you do flip the coin though, I do think a lot of people might want to use like the 300ZX, which I really do think is going to be a pretty decent car overall, and I'm sure it isn't going to be like the best street car, because I do want to mention that I do feel like a lot of players are wondering how some of these new cars are going to stack up against something like the Superleggera and or something like the Countach, and I would probably say if you were using the Malu Edition, you're most likely going to get smoked. But one of my favorite things about this Z though, guys, is going to be the way it does handle. I was doing one of the events going from like Seattle and or to like San Francisco, and I do feel like this car was insanely fun to use on the coast going around those corners. It was basically going around them with ease, and it wasn't sliding and or feeling very like janky. And one car I was also noticing this with was going to be the 429 Lime Edition, because I would say around most of the corners, that car really did feel like it basically wanted to, like, I guess slide and or lose traction completely. So jumping back into something like the Malu Edition honestly felt way better than that one. And I would say, guys, if you were wondering how this car is going to do, because yes, it's a 5-speed, so the overall acceleration might feel a tad different than like a Superleggera, and I normally do run manual, so I'm actually having to shift through these gears pretty often with these cars. And one thing I did notice with the Malu Edition is I wasn't having issues accelerating with this car, at least compared to the Camaro. The Ghost Edition that was in the Motor Pass I noticed was honestly overall very slow. Even though that car did around 250, it really did struggle to get there, and I was noticing like a big delay between shifts, which I really do think a lot of the cars are most likely going to struggle, even because they actually do have a delay, and we all know that's obviously going to be a normal thing. Like, it's not a thing on the Crew 2. The car obviously does have to engage into the next gear, so it's not like a weird mystery on why it's doing that. But overall though, guys, I really do think the Malu Edition is actually going to be a pretty nice car overall. And to be honest, guys, if you were thinking about getting this car, I would really recommend going after it. Not only is this thing actually going to be insanely rare on Motorfest, because the only players that will have this car are the ones that actually did the Malu story here on the Crew 2, so I really would go after this vehicle. Not only does it look pretty dang awesome, it also has some pretty decent acceleration, which, by the way, can actually be slightly improved on Motorfest because the engine on that game is different, and I do feel like that's most likely going to bring cars like the Malu Edition basically out of the pit, and I do feel like a lot more people are actually going to mess around with cars like this, and I really do feel like that's going to be needed. That way the meta is actually mixed up. I would like to know your thoughts on this Malu Edition in the comments below, and don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more insight.